So good morning, everyone. I wasn't really expecting a room to be this full after this is like the morning after the night before. I wasn't sure whether people were just going to be hungover or listening to the new Taylor Swift album that dropped a couple of hours ago. It was going to be a tough. But I want to thank Guy for that. Rabbi Sacks always used to start some of his speeches with a great line which you can all plagiarize, which is, "Compliments are fine so long as you don't inhale," which is a lovely remark. I also want to thank Brian for the invite. He kindly invited me last year as a participant on the condition that I came back this year to speak, which is it's a real pleasure. When obviously we're about a week out of the Jewish festival of Passover, and for any of you that know anything about Passover, it's a very intense period in Judaism and for Jewish families, especially the lead up to it, the preparation. So my wife is delighted that I'm here in the 3 days. In fact, she actually said to me, "This is basically a spa break for geeks," which is a lovely. I'm yet to find the jacuzzi, but it's a lovely start. But it is. I mean, this is obviously probably the most intimidating audience to speak in front of. To give a speech in front of speechwriters is not exactly. You know, you often walk into a room and you're fairly confident. I've got the words and I've put them in the right order. But in here, you kind of feel there are eyes that are just judging every word that you say. So I will do my best. And you know, Renee made a fantastic opening speech at last year's conference, and I think she said something like, and forgive me if I get it slightly wrong, but you said, you know, I'm glad that Brian put me first on the agenda because it meant I only miss breakfast and I'm not going to miss lunch. Well, I'm here on Friday morning and my wife is very grateful that you helped the diet from putting me quite so late on in the agenda. So you might be wondering why Brian has asked me to speak at this conference, and it's not just because, as we've seen from the banner, Brian is very keen on a biblical phrase or two or some biblical imagery. But it's sort of to talk about Rabbi Sacks and not his life, well, in part his life and his work, but also how he framed that and what it was about the way he framed, the way he wrote, and the way he lived and conducted his life that kind of gave him such an impact across so many different spheres of public life. He actually, and this is to Guy's point about the Oxford-Cambridge debate, Rabbi Sacks went to Gonville and Keys, which is just down the road, but then he did his undergrad at Cambridge, his master's at Oxford, and then a PhD at King's. So he was kind of like, he could legitimately have cheered for both sides in the boat race. So I want to begin by making one thing very, very clear. I was not Rabbi Sacks' speechwriter. Right? Rabbi Sacks was the best wordsmith I've ever come across. Well, Saradin might dispute that in terms of Barack Obama, but for me personally, he was an absolute master of words. And my role with him as an advisor sort of encompassed a whole load of different things, from being that thought partner, being that sort of challenger, that ideas generator, that editor on some occasions. And yes, there were some moments where I scripted certain things, but in the main, any major speech that has been quoted was his work and his hand. And there was a story that kind of encapsulated this, whereby I was on. It was the first week of the job. I started working for him in 2011, and I worked for him from 2011 right up until he passed away in November 2020, and then spent sort of the best part of 2 years setting up a legacy trust and doing a digital archive of all of his work, which you can look at rabbisacks.org. And then sort of moved on to Milltown Partners and into sort of the consultancy world in March 22. But the very first week that I started working for him, we were working on an article. Or he was working on an article, and he sent it to me. He used to work at home in his study, which was, as you'll see, there is a picture which you can have a look. So it was basically just books. Like everywhere in his house was floor-to-ceiling books. So he was sitting at his desk, at this desk, working on an article, and he sort of emailed it to me, and I was in the office, and it was my first week on the job. This for me was the dream job. Like, it was not going to get any better than this. And I opened up the article and I read it was either a thought for the day or a credo column in the Times or something. And I read the piece, and it was beautiful. And I sent him back an email, this is great, really like the argument, great flow. Shall I send it in? I sent it back. 2 seconds later, less than 2 seconds later, there was my phone went, and it was withheld number, and I knew that it was him. I picked it up, and on the other end of the line was obviously Rabbi Sacks, and he sort of said to me, Dan, there's 1 million people in the world who would give me that feedback. That's not your job. And then he said 6 words that sort of framed our entire relationship over the next best part of a decade. He said, you are empowered to say no, right? And so he said, don't worry, I know what I need to do, and he put the phone down. And 10 minutes later, a much better version of the article appeared in my inbox with 1 word in the email, send. I was like, fine. The next week, we're working on another article. And again, he's at his desk, I'm in the office, comes through on email. And I sort of said, I said to myself, look, I'm not making the same mistake twice. I opened up this article. I literally edited every single line, like left comments, why have you pulled your punch, like did this, did that. Like, the ending, the first half strong, it loses a bit of momentum here. And I was really like, I went for it, right? And again, I somewhat hesitated, but I attached it back on the email and I pressed send. Less than 10 seconds later, the withheld number came up on the phone. And I picked it up thinking, in my head, I can see how this conversation is going out. Dan, this was great. We had a great working relationship. I don't think this is going to work out. Thanks for your time and your service. Exactly. And I picked up the phone, and there was him on the other end of the line, and he just went, better, right? And that was him. It was that sense of, that constant sense of improvement, that constant drive for the next article, the next speech, the next broadcast to be better than the last. And he surrounded himself with people who were empowered to say no. And that, I think, is a point for any principal, any leader. Those leaders that want yes people around them are not good leaders. The leaders who want people to challenge them with humility on their part and yours, but those that are empowered to say no are the advisors and the leaders that are really worth working for, in my opinion. So I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions, and we've got a little bit of extra time to play with. And what I want to do here is not go deep into rhetorical techniques. We've had a lot of that. And all of you know, like if you pick up any Rabbi Sacks speech, you'll see, all the devices and all the techniques that we're all very familiar with. What I want to do is kind of do what Larry sort of did and take a bit of a step back and look at what was the broader framing of his work. What was that sort of deeper ideology that meant that he had the impact on the various audiences that he spoke to. And he had a great saying, he had many sayings, but he once said, the choice with which humankind is faced in every age is between the idea of power and the power of ideas. And I think for us as speechwriters, we can adapt that truthfully and say, the choice with which speechwriters are faced in every speech is between the idea of power and the power of ideas. And I think for us, the speeches that work, the speeches that hit home, are the ones that are not concerned about the principal's position or the principal's. They're about ideas. They're about what are those kind of things that are going to shift that broader narrative and move that conversation on. And so, what was it about him, and what was that sort of big idea that gave him that influence? And again, touching on Larry, let's first set up the problem, right? Let's understand a few things. In Britain, as Alistair Campbell famously once said, we don't do God, right? So here's a religious leader wanting influence beyond his flock, and yet we're in a country that doesn't do God, right? We're also in a country where, and in a world where interest in faith is declining. You look at any poll and you see the greatest religion growing anywhere in the world is people of no faith has become its own religion. And you look in the media, you only have to look this morning, and religion doesn't get a good rap. It's often the bad side of religion that you see, not the good side of religion. And as Rabbi Sacks used to say, like, what in society is a virtue, in religion is a vice, namely compromise. right? So society and politics is all about how do you come together. Religion is about absolute truths according to whatever faith you believe in. And then there's the simple numbers game, right? The Jewish community in the UK is 270,000 people. That is, if my maths is correct, 0.4% of 66 million people, right? Globally, there's about 15.5 million Jews in the world out of a population of 8 billion. And that, I think, is 0.2%. So the numbers don't exactly stack in your favor if you're a Jewish leader wanting to have some influence beyond the Jewish community. And of course, there were obvious reasons why he managed to achieve that. For starters, he was chief rabbi for 22 years, right, from 91 to 2013. There was a certain degree of influence that came by virtue of the position. So he had opportunity to engage with leaders and other things, but there's degrees of influence. There's sort of you can have the influence just because you hold the position, but how do you go out beyond that? He was a great orator. Like, there were certain things, like you can do delivery coaching, you can do other things, but if the best speakers are naturally gifted. You know, Sarada worked for one of the greatest orators the world has ever seen. I was fortunate, in my opinion, that I also worked for one of the greatest orators the world. You know, he really had the ability to do that cadence and that flow and make speeches sound like songs and kind of go up and down in that narrative. And you know, part of the reason why he did that was he very rarely wrote transcripts, which is part of the reason why I rarely wrote speeches. Was, you know, he saw speeches not as lectures but as conversations. And I think there is a great art to our profession of writing transcripts and delivering transcripts. But as we all know, those leaders who have the ability to have conversations with audiences are those leaders that have that greater ability to move them from A to B. And then there was, of course, the beautiful rhetoric that we all know. Like there were metaphors, contrasts, self-deprecating humor in all of his speeches all the time. So there was a natural kind of empathy that people had because of the way that he spoke and the way that he delivered his messages. He worked really, really hard. Like, people often think speakers come up, or with him, you'd often go to a thing and people are like, oh, he's just so naturally brilliant, right? It's like an iceberg. Like, you see the tip of it, but he would work constantly, hours and hours, drafts and drafts of every sort of speech he ever gave. And he never dumbed things down. He always tried to raise the audience up. He never tried to make them feel stupid. You sort of often would ask people, well, what was it like when you were hearing him speak? He was this super intellectual giant, and yet you never felt like he was patronizing or anything else. He was trying to bring the audience to his level, not go down to theirs. And that's a great thing to have. The humility. No, I think that humble personality, to turn to someone like me, who frankly, when I started working for him, I was like early 30s, and be like, what do you think? Like, what do you think I should say? What do you, like, that ability to go to people around him and to get that sense and not kind of be that know-it-all. The mind, the ability to tell mesmerizing stories, you know, the willingness to give without ever expecting to receive was a great virtue of his and is a great virtue of loads of leaders. He was a unifier, not a divider. So there's a reason why Tony Blair called him an intellectual giant, David Cameron called him my rabbi. He had engagement with President Clinton where he wrote letters, and Pence reached out to him with some support when he was giving a speech in Israel on some of the kind of connection between Judaism and Israel. None of the policy stuff, I promise you. We just did the Jewish bit. But he also had that magical thing called gravitas, which is something that money just can't buy. There was a sense of when he walked in the room, it was like the walking personification of wisdom, and he had a tone of voice. You know, some people, you know, the amount of people said, oh, he could have just read me the phone book, and I would have like listened to him for hours. And anyone who heard him on A Thought for the Day on BBC Radio, there was that unmistakable tone of voice that just lent itself to giving great speeches. And then he had this amazing ability to take complex subjects and make them simple and offer them in language that people could understand, but importantly, without losing any of the depth. So here's a few examples. On religion and science, he wrote, "Science takes things apart to see how they work. Religion puts things together to see what they mean." I mean, that is like, unpack that and you're into like a 3-day academic seminar, right? Interfaith dialogue, he spoke about the dignity of difference. He spoke about how our common humanity precedes our religious differences. Again, simple words, short sentences, incredible depth. Faith as being the courage not to live with certainty, but to live with uncertainty. Artificial intelligence, the uniqueness at the heart of humanity exists not in intelligence which can be artificial, but in loving and being loved. So there was, and on religion and extremism, the solution to bad religion is not no religion, but good religion. Like, these are simple words, simple constructed sentences, and yet the depth in those comments and those, it was unbelievable the way he managed to do that. And so, like, what was it? So there were some reasons, and, you know, when he stepped down in 2013, we did a gala dinner where the then Prince of Wales came, and he sort of gave a phenomenal speech, because they were very close friends. And he sort of misquoted the prophet Isaiah and said, you know, Rabbi Sacks, you have been a light unto this nation. Right? So what was it about his life? And I think you can divide his life and his writings into two parts. On the one hand, there was the Jewish stuff. There was Rabbi Sacks, right? And Rabbi Sacks was a Jewish scholar of immense knowledge. Like, he often didn't get the credit necessarily from the Jewish world as to how much wisdom he had in that side of stuff. That he could give lectures in, you know, Jewish seminaries and everything that would blow people away. And so he had this well of Jewish wisdom to draw on, or faith to draw on, that he managed to make relevant to the modern world. There was a story of when he was younger, walking to synagogue with his dad, and he was about 5 or 6 years old. And he would pepper his dad with questions like, what's this? Why do we do this? Why do we do this? And his father, who was an immigrant, came over from Poland, sort of turned to him and he said, you know, Jonathan, I've never had the Jewish education. I've never had a Jewish education, so I can't answer your questions. But one day I promise you will have the education and you will teach me the answers to those questions. And I think there was a sense of, like, there was the education is so critical within Judaism, but it was for him, it was like from a very young age, there was that inquisitive mind and that sense of always wanting to know that the answer to that question, why. And then there's the other stuff, right? So you had Rabbi Sacks here, you had Jonathan Sacks here. Right? Jonathan Sacks was the public intellectual. He was the moral philosopher. He was the first of his 4 brothers to go to university. He originally went to university here to study economics. He then moved to philosophy. At one point he wanted to be an economist, then a lawyer, then an academic. Right? He never wanted to be a rabbi. Right? He came to the rabbinate very late on in his life, only really after the 6-Day War in 1967, sort of reignited something within his being, and he sort of went and he spoke to a lot of people, and they were like, look, you've got these skills, you've got this ability, you have to kind of engage. So he sort of took that wisdom, right? And actually throughout his life, even though he didn't want to be or he wanted to be an economist and a lawyer and ended up being a rabbi, he delivered some of the UK's greatest economic lectures. He became an honorary member of Inner Temple, and he became chief rabbi. So he kind of excelled in all of them, even though he sort of went down one particular route. But he published over 40 books during his life. He got 18 honorary doctorates. And these were, you know, yes, there was a chunk of those books that were on the Jewish side of stuff, but there was a huge number of those books that were in that moral philosophy and that secular wisdom. The 18 honorary doctorates were sitting in this side of things. Like that. So you had this kind of like split personality within one individual of a faith leader and a public intellectual. And the easy thing would have been to have gone down one of those routes. Pick a side and go deep. And you know, and what made him so brilliant was the way that he connected both of those bits. Right? So he always said, a Judaism divorced from society will be a Judaism unable to influence society. So it was like, how do you take the stuff that you've got here with the knowledge that you've got here, and how do you merge them in the middle? So if there's that Venn diagram, right, you have very well-known rabbis, very well-known Jewish public intellectuals, but who are those people that sit in the middle? And he was the best of the bunch. And so he would show through his writings that the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, wasn't just a story of a journey of a people to a promised land. It was about leadership and being led. It was about governing and being governed. It was about a social contract and a social covenant. It was about hope and despair, wisdom and struggle, vision, a promise broken, a promise restored, about wickedness, about redemption. It was about ethics and the very basis of a society and what makes us human. And because he was able to look into those ancient texts and make them relevant to the very challenges that we were facing, he was viewed by people as a source of wisdom. And then on the other side, he would look at all the progress that was going on, all the new economic theories, psychology. I mean, I used to joke with him that he would single-handedly keep Amazon in business because every day there were deliveries of books to the house. Like, I mean, the picture doesn't do justice, but I once took my daughter to his house because I had to pop by. And when we left the house, she was very quiet in the house because, you know, and we left the house and she's like, Daddy, is that a home or a library? Right? And it's because every single room, floor to ceiling, right, when they moved into their home after he stepped down as chief rabbi, they flattened all the walls in the house and built bookshelves. Like when he left his official residence, we estimated, and I know because I more or less unpacked them with him, that there were about 20,000 books, right, in his personal library. So there was that sense of, what can I take from the secular world? What are the new theories? What are the new ideas that are being generated? And how do they relate back to those ancient teachings? And I think, and so you would often see he wrote a weekly commentary essay on the Hebrew Bible. And there was not an essay that went by that was just drawing on Jewish texts. It would touch on Jewish texts, but it would bring in, there was this study that Cambridge, have just published, right? And it's saying this, and it's this. And, you know, the book, his last published book was called Morality, which I think there's a copy on sale. It's one that I worked with him on the research side of stuff. And I remember sitting in a car and being like, you know, Oxford University have just published this study where they're saying there are these 6 kind of common denominators or 7 common denominators that like all societies that are good societies have. Right? And he would laugh because he would be like, well, obviously there's 7. There's the 7 Noahide laws that were like done way, way back, and they're practically the same. But we would use that study as a way of drawing out that teaching. And it was that kind of constant circle of how does one relate to the other and one reinforce the arguments that you're trying to make in both of those worlds. And that's why he sort of, people would reach out to him. You know, prime ministers would reach out to him and ask for his advice on various things because, frankly, it was different. A conversation with Rabbi Sacks was very different to a conversation with the Archbishop of Canterbury. The Archbishop of Canterbury is a hugely political position. Rabbi Sacks is not going to ask the prime minister why he wasn't in church on Sunday. Right? So there was a different approach, a different sense of what this person, what this individual could offer. You know, often prime ministers would come to him with a problem. They'd be like, there's this thing going on in society. So multiculturalism, you know, in the early mid-2000s was a real issue, and they would ask Rabbi Sacks, and he would say, look, I can't give you an answer now. I need to write the book. And he would go away, and he wrote a book. So The Home We Build Together, which was how do we move society on beyond multiculturalism, became part of government policy. Right? But he was, because he was that deep thinker, he didn't give like snap judgments. He would always go away and think about things. It increased the value, and that increased the influence, and that sort of expanded the circle of people that were interested in him. And so he kind of became this translator and this explainer between these two worlds, the world of religion and the world of secular knowledge. And he helped explain one to the other. And he sort of wasn't afraid to take on the toughest questions. You know, where was God in the Holocaust? Right? That was a question that Rabbi Sacks would take on. And his answer was, we know where God was. The question is, where was man? Right? And you know, there was this sense of, you're talking to someone who's not going to give you a quick answer, the kind of answer that you're looking for, that instant sense of gratification in a digital age. That's not him. That wasn't him. And he did it all from a place of genuine love. Love of other faiths, other people. And he understood this difference between power and influence. Right? Power being a zero-sum game. The more power I have, the less power you have. Influence is different. Like, if I'm sharing knowledge, it's, you know, if I give you all a pound, right, and then I take the pounds for myself, I've got all the money and you've got none of it. If I give you love or respect or whatever, we all have more collectively. And that's how he viewed wisdom. It was a sense of, it's not, I'm not in it for power. I'm in it because I want to talk about ideas, I want to talk about influence. It's a reason why, although he was a member of the House of Lords, he never voted. He never voted once, because voting was about power. He was about influence. So he would go and he would speak in debates, but he would never vote. And he never took money when he went to the House of Lords either, just in case anyone's, you know. But he also, he would say, like, power works by division, influence by multiplication. Power, in other words, is a zero-sum game. The more you share, the less you have. Influence is a non-zero-sum game. The more you share, the more you have. Politicians have power, but religion has something greater than power. It has influence. Politics moves the pieces, but religion changes lives. And he kind of saw that as like the way in which he operated and the way in which he wrote. And then through his books and through his articles, it was also the way he constructed his arguments. Right? So traditional faith leaders would start really with faith-based arguments. They'd start with scripture. Right? And if we look in scripture, we can say X. Right? Rabbi Sacks flipped it around. He knew that the second that you talk about scripture, you're alienating a percentage of the audience that you're trying to influence. So he would talk about the secular structure of arguments, the secular knowledge. He would take from this bucket first, and then only at the end would he draw on this bucket. So if you listen to any of his Thought for the Day broadcasts, or especially if you watch his TED Talk, you see he talks about what we could do as a society to move beyond the future of fear. And he talks about the future us. He talks about the us of relationship, the us of responsibility, and the us of identity. And he does that for 10 of the 11 minutes of the talk, or 10 and a half minutes of the 11 minutes of the talk. And only at the end does he say, as we say in Psalms, when you walk through the valley of death, I shall fear no evil, for you are with me. You know, the way we can face the future without fear is to face it together. Right? One line of religion. But it was a very deliberate tactic that he used over and over again. And those of us that were in Larry's workshop on Wednesday heard him talk about the difference between the professional voice and the vocation voice, right? And how the professional voice is all about method. The vocation voice is all about values. And Larry drew an image where there are sort of individuals, and you can talk to people at an individual level, but the way that you connect them is by elevating that conversation to a higher plane where you're talking about values and what connects us. And it was at that plane that Rabbi Sacks had all of his rhetoric and all of his insights. And that's what allowed him to do what was his big idea and his ultimate philosophy and his deep ideology, which was about universalizing particularity. He wanted to take his particular faith and he wanted to make it universal, not in a proselytizing way. Judaism is not one of those faiths, but in a way that, without lessening his belief, he was able to share Judaism, share the Jewish experience, share Jewish values with a much wider population in a non-religious, non-enforcing way that drew people to him. And he said, by being what we alone are, we bring to the world what only we can give. That sense of each of us has something to contribute to this broader conversation of humankind. And his particular thing was, I'm a faith leader, but I'm not just a faith leader. There's something that faith can bring to this broader conversation. And that's why, former Prime Minister Tony Blair gave a lecture on the first anniversary of his passing. Rabbi Sacks passed away aged 72, very suddenly in November 2020, from cancer. It was the third time he had cancer. He survived it in his 30s, he survived it in his 40s. Unfortunately, he got it in his 70s and died. 72 nowadays is not an old age. He stepped down from office in age 65. We had a 15-year plan from 65 to 80 as to the books he was going to write, the things we were going to do, how it was kind of all going to roll out. Unfortunately, it wasn't to be. But Tony Blair gave a lecture on the first anniversary of his passing, and he said, the very unusual gift Jonathan had was to explain the past to the living and to show that it should be treated with respect, not as tradition alone, but as wisdom passed from one age to another. And ultimately, if you look at the world today, you can't get away from the fact that faith has a massive impact on it, right? But faith is like fire. It can burn and it can warm. And I think there's a lot of things about faith that can cause things to burn. And there's not enough things about faith that can cause people to get warm. And it was that sense of that combination of that timeless wisdom that sat in this bucket here of Rabbi Sacks as Rabbi Sacks, with the timely wisdom that sat in this bucket here of Jonathan Sacks as the public intellectual. And that ability to merge the timeless with the timely was the thing that made him who he was. And so I want to leave time for questions. I'm very happy to answer anything. But sort of the Americans like a takeaway, right? So what's the takeaway, right? The takeaway is quite simple. Go online and watch one of his speeches. Watch his TED Talk, watch his Templeton Prize acceptance speech, and you will see all of these techniques and all the rhetorical stuff that you've spoken about in all the different sessions come to bear and come to fruition in those speeches. And in many others. He gave a speech about anti-Semitism, which he called a mutating virus, in the European Parliament in 2016, a very powerful address. Look at his stuff, engage with his work, because I think it's not, and don't think, oh, I'm reading a rabbi. You are, but you're reading a whole lot more than that, that hopefully in this world is the kind of religious leaders that we need. Thank you very much.